I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Van Davis, who is highly skilled at quickly taking information such as the discussions that you've had and kind of compiling them into hopefully something useful for you in an overview. So
no pressure.
Give him a moment while we trade computers.
Perfect. So of the 6 scenarios, 5 of them were done. What I'm going to do is go through them very quickly since you guys don't know who did what and what the other scenarios were. I'm going to I've pulled out a couple of the goals that came out of each of the scenarios, and then what I really want to do is spend a few minutes talking about that what's needed question, because I think to some extent that helps us play into that second symposia that Dr. Sebesta was mentioning that we'll have in July, and that's where, interestingly enough, we see a lot of similarities and a lot of overlaps emerge. So first scenario you guys are familiar with. You saw it earlier in the let's see how we do this sort of design thinking. What came together though as goals were, we saw several folks talk about partnering with employers for degree relevance, provide academic advising and support to meet students' needs to ensure their success, and these two actually came up across a number of the scenarios. And then connect students to the college's social network and facilitate faculty-staff connections for positive peer influences. And I think as we go through, you'll see not only how these are very similar in some cases, but you will also see how they echo back a lot of the conversations that we've had so far today. So scenario 2, student was born in 2011 to a prominent, wealthy American political family. Expected to follow in the family business, she aspires to live and work abroad in a completely different field and plans to start college after a gap year, much to her family's consternation. Folks opted as a goal student support that is understanding but not prescriptive, a broad, relevant general academic program with interdisciplinary areas, establish educational and residential experience that accommodates various students' interests. Our third scenario has a student being born in 1995, a single father who's working full-time, hasn't been able to advance in his profession, and he really wants a career in an entirely different field. Folks talked about as a goal ensuring timely degree completion. We've heard that today. Creating valid pathways for technical degrees that have supportive environments and teach soft skills, another thing that has come up throughout the day, and even I think in our most recent panel. Scenario number 4, student was born in 1975 and took early retirement, and I don't know about you, but this scenario makes me feel really old, that somebody born in 1975 is taking early retirement. After years of a successful career, she has a degree but is returning to college in order to explore the possibility of a second career. And here we have folks that talked about a fast-track, competency-based education that would be a goal, developing student support for change, focusing on mentoring, counseling, and support services. That support services seems to come up over and over again. And adaptable bridge credentialing programs, so she doesn't have to start over from scratch. Our 5th student was born in 2013 and is graduating with honors a year early from high school. She's passionate about music and medicine. English is her second language. And her immigrant parents have struggled to make ends meet, and they've not been able to save for her college education. And here folks talked about 2 primary goals: designing a system that takes care of each individual student, understanding that they're unique, and providing flexible financial opportunities that also included wraparound student support services. So as I was going through these things, there's a couple of terms that kept coming up over and over again. Wraparound student support services is one of them. What we really saw were these 6 sort of big groupings of what's needed. Flexible staffing, fewer restrictive policies, flexible instruction, nimble institutions, somebody actually used that language, nimble, expanded partnerships, and it's always all about the money, new funding models. Let me give you a couple of examples of each of these, and then I'm going to let Dr. Sebesta sort of wrap things up for today. And as she said, this information actually is going to be pulled into the white paper. So under flexible staffing, one of the things that I thought at least that was really interesting was a number of folks talked about the need for professional development for both their faculty and the staff, and that was going to be an ongoing need. In fact, it was going to be an even more important need because we were going to see significant changes in higher education in the next few decades. We also saw another example of that, another flavor of that professional development was another group talked about the need for new talent management tools. I don't know how often in higher education we think about talent management, but when we do, it's usually talking about faculty. In this case, they were talking about staff as well. And they also, a number of groups talked about the need for faculty and staff that reflected student demographics, and the fact that faculty needed to play a role outside of the classroom, whether that be through advising, academic advising. One group even suggested that faculty had a role to play in career advising, and getting students ready for what happens after they leave the campus. Fewer restrictive policies, one of the things that interestingly came up more than once, not surprising, accreditation. But one of the other things that came up here as a restrictive policy is the academic calendar that we work on. That old agrarian-based calendar that even though we're not agrarian anymore, we seem to still be using. And one group suggested that that had served its purpose. Under flexible instruction, competency-based education came up several times, no surprise there. But one of the other things that came up was the importance of curriculum mapping, particularly with general education. The development of modular curriculum that might not be competency-based. And I thought this was really interesting. Another group suggested that we need to find ways to allow students to design their own end. What is it that they want in consultation with faculty and staff and advisors? If they want a degree, great, let's help them devise it. If they think that what they need is a credential, then let's help them figure that out and devise it. But letting them have some say in what their end goal might need to be. Nimble institutions, there was a lot of talking about being able to find ways to share resources with other institutions as well as other partners like employers. That we needed to be thinking about cultural change, the culture of higher education changing, that we needed institutions that were willing to fail. And it struck me, that one struck me as interesting because I think a lot of times we've talked about students, at least when I was teaching, I talked about students being willing to take risks and fail. But I don't know how often we actually talk about that from an institutional perspective, or perhaps even feel like that we're within cultures that allow that. And that might have something to do with that one before there about flexible or fewer restrictive policies and accreditation, I'm guessing. And then we had this idea of expanded partnerships, not just with high schools and employers to find jobs, but also working with employers to create internships, to create work study, finding different ways to work with families as well. And then finally, this idea of new funding models that came up a few times, whether that be finding new ways for tuition and fees to be looked at, whether that meant finding new ways for state funding to be developed, new scholarship funding models, but this idea that, rightfully so, nothing's cheap, nothing's free, and that we have to find other ways perhaps to look at how we're funding higher education. So that's, in a nutshell, sort of what you guys did. There's some very good artists amongst you, by the way. Really quite impressive. And I think actually a lot of overlap between each other, and as Dr. Sebesta will talk about, a lot of overlap with what we've talked about today and setting things up very well for July.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. And thanks to all of you for sticking with us here this afternoon. And if you'll let me, I'd like to take about 10 minutes to provide a few of my impressions and some through lines that I have observed throughout the day. And then you can obviously read more about this in the white paper that I will be compiling, which we'll make sure all of you get a copy of. But, you know, I began with an image of a door frame, and also talked about framing a barn or a house. And so I just want to start out with some random images that that I have seen throughout the day, starting from Dr. Mark Schneider's cartoon that he showed us, which I thought was a very evocative image, to the image of the self-actualized student, moving stones, mental cubicles, 360 perspectives, medieval studies and cathedrals, the American dream, journeys and wanderings, moving targets, revolving doors, short attention spans, disruptive ideas, lifelong learning, career entrepreneurs, precipices, flexibility, and a new idea of what the traditional student is or isn't. I don't know about you, but throughout this day, I've been reflecting a bit on my own experience and my trajectory as a student in higher education. That was a long trajectory. I started in 1984, got my bachelor's degree at Austin College. I went to Florida and got my master's degree at Florida State University, and then I came back to my home state, got my PhD here at the University of Texas. Currently, though, I'm a student again. I'm a student in the Duke University Coursera MOOC, The History and Future of Mostly Higher Education. And it's a very interesting experience. And I think what I'm finding is just, on the one hand, how much has changed in terms of learning and instruction in higher ed since I first started as a student in '84, but also how much is actually kind of the same. It's just been kind of striking for me. But I also want to say that I had forgotten about when I came up with the model of the door as a frame, or framing a house or framing a barn, with another definition of the word frame. And I've been thinking about this other definition throughout the day, which is the frame that we put around a painting or a portrait, type of frame that you can see in film, a proscenium frame of a theatrical event. These are all devices that focus the human eye. And I think what we're doing today is we're taking time to discuss that big picture that really helps us focus and hone in on things, and specifically hone in on the notion of what are the purposes of higher ed and how can we help our students succeed. So let me just talk a little, just go down a list here of some of the purposes and goals and benefits that I have heard throughout the day. The public good, achieving the American dream, the increasingly elusive American dream, self-actualization, workforce training and preparedness, increasing income potential, ability to face complex challenges, to collaborate with individuals from different perspectives than your own, to develop 360 perspectives required of leaders, to contribute to democracy and create good citizens, to gain a global perspective. Imaginative problem solving and lifelong learning to enable students to move from remediation to quickening. National security, promoting research, innovation, fostering disruptive ideas, and from this final panel, developing talent. That's a lot. And what I noticed is that we're not all going to agree on what is the primary purpose or how to prioritize all of these things and others that we haven't had a chance to discuss or mention. But a through line has been that we seem to agree, at least in this room today, that it shouldn't be an either-or proposition, but an and proposition. Dr. Bedrone said that students are the lifeblood of this country. I think that we can, through multiple methods, institutions, processes, and purposes, find ways to help students self-actualize, remediate, think critically, learn, relearn, and unlearn, make a living, live better lives, and succeed in whatever way that might mean for them. So to wrap up, finally, this symposium has been about the questions of why. Our next symposium in July is going to be about how. How do we fulfill these sometimes lofty purposes and goals? How do we help our students succeed? So be sure and save the date. On July 11th, we're going to convene back here at the AT&T Conference Center to discuss instruction and learning in higher education in the 21st century. Your ideas today are going to be integral in shaping that next symposium and hopefully the future of higher education. I want to thank all of our speakers. I want to once again thank Houston Endowment for sponsoring this event, but most of all, I want to thank all of you for participating and sharing your ideas. Have a great evening.